Hello and welcome to Pittsburgh City Council's Post Agenda for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019. My name is Kim Clark Baskin and I'm your Deputy City Clerk. With us today, we have our sign language interpreter, Emily Pearson. The following is a topic to be discussed by Pittsburgh City Council. There will be an agenda item at the request of Councilmember Teresa Kell Smith with a discussion on autonomous vehicles. There will be specific guests that the Councilwoman has invited to discuss this topic. Thank you for tuning in and have a wonderful day.
Good afternoon and welcome to Pittsburgh City Council's Cablecast Post Agenda regarding autonomous vehicles. We called this Post Agenda, and I want to say that we called this, it was three of us, three council members who were having a sidebar conversation saying that we needed to call it. So I want to acknowledge Councilwoman Gross and Councilman O'Connor, and I want to say that our colleagues all agreed, and so I'm sure some of them will be out shortly to discuss. But you came to the table before and to the podium before, and you had some very important comments that you had made, and it made me want to call for a post agenda and to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more. Usually post agendas are fact-finding meetings, and I want to be honest, this is pretty much going to be a one-side conversation, because I think we've heard a lot of the conversations publicly otherwise in support and all the benefits there are to the city of Pittsburgh. I think for us as council members, we want to know what exactly the benefit truly is, how our residents feel about it, and how we can make sure we're improving and working with the administration to make sure that we're getting great outcomes for our residents. I'm not saying for or against autonomous vehicles, but what I am saying is that we want to make sure that we're preserving jobs, that we have great union jobs, and we want to make sure we're preserving those jobs. We want to make sure that we're preparing the workforce, that the residents that already live in Pittsburgh for the workforce for tomorrow and whatever that might be. And while I understand and appreciate that there's a lot of challenges, and Pittsburgh needs to grow our city. We need to grow our residency base. And if this is one way to do it, that's wonderful. But we also don't want to forget the people that have built Pittsburgh, and we don't want to leave them behind. And we want to make sure that everyone is safe, including our bicyclists and our pedestrians on the streets, and that they feel this comfort level as we start approaching with these more and more autonomous vehicles in our area. So with that said, I'm going to mention that we are joined by Councilwoman Gross and Councilman O'Connor. Do either one of you want to make an opening statement before I turn it over to the... Okay, I know we don't typically do that, but because this is a subject that we all talked about, I want to give them the same opportunity. So could you please start to introduce yourselves, starting here, and then we'll hear a bit of each of what you have to say after you introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon, I'm Shefali Rai. I am the environmental representative for Union of Concerned Scientists Science Network, and I am here to weigh in on the environmental impacts of autonomous vehicles. I hold a Master of Science in Energy Science with a concentration in Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon University.
Good afternoon. My name is Jarvis Williams. I'm the president of TW Local 208, where bus is nothing without us in Columbus, Ohio. I'm here to share our experiences that we have had with the introduction of autonomous vehicles in Columbus, Ohio.
My name is Mike Skirpin. I am a special faculty at Carnegie Mellon of Computing Ethics. I also am the director of a community center, Community Forge in Wilkinsburg. And I'm pretty much here as a data science and machine learning expert and sort of looking at what the data privacy implications of adding this corridor and adding autonomous vehicles are. So my goal is just to sort of give information and perspective on what that would take to do in the interest of the public as opposed to the interest of private industry that wants to do this.
My name is Eric Bohr. I'm the advocacy director of Bike Pittsburgh and a Lawrenceville resident. We're a 3,500 member nonprofit bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organization. Over the past couple of years, we've done some surveying of our members, as well as a lot of Pittsburgh residents, on how they feel about sharing the road with autonomous vehicles. So we're here to share some of that information.
My name is Laura Weens. I'm the Executive Director of Pittsburghers for Public Transit. And we have been working over the past year to put together this literature review that you have in front of us that looks at more than 100 scholarly peer-reviewed academic articles around the impacts of autonomous vehicles across a spectrum of impacts. So, but I will be speaking to the mobility and public transit implications of autonomous vehicles.
Thank you. And I'm going to say we're also joined by our colleague, Councilman Coghill. How would you like to start, Don? This and this?
You know, I'm going to do it in a little bit of an odd order. I think that I would love for Jarvis Williams, the president of the TWU, to speak first, if that would be. That's good. Fine.
Again, good afternoon, council members. My name is Jarvis Williams. I am the president of Transport Workers Local 208 in Columbus, Ohio. I have worked for the Central Ohio Transit Authority for 28 years. For the past 10 years of that, I have been a mechanic. Local 208 represents 650 bus operators and 160 mechanics, as well as customer service representative, farebox pullers, and CIC. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about an experience with autonomous commercial shuttles in Columbus, Ohio. As a brief overview, in 2016, Columbus won the DOT Smart City Challenge, beating out more than 70 other cities for a $50 million grant. One component of the Smart Columbus plan was an autonomous shuttle that was to connect a transit center to an employment center in the eastern neighborhood of Columbus. That plan was changed because the shuttle speed was too low to allow for the safe cross of a major thoroughfare of the proposed route. Instead, the shuttle now circulates around downtown Columbus as a private startup site for tourists. The service, which began late last year and is operated by May Mobility, right now, the shuttle has an attendant on board, but Smart Columbus' goal of operating an unmanned shuttle is clear. In their proposal, they state explicitly that a major benefit of a fully autonomous vehicle is the reduction of costs achieved by eliminating the operator and all onboard equipment necessary for human operations. We have two main concerns about the introduction of autonomous vehicles in Columbus. Our first is job loss, needless to say. Given Smart Columbus' goal of eliminating bus operators, job loss is a significant concern among our membership. These are good jobs that have provided solid middle-class income for generations of blue-collar workers. In Columbus, the top wage for a coda operator is $29.71, which is well above Ohio median wage of $18 and Columbus median wage of $18.89. Jobs at CODA and at many other transit agencies are union jobs that also provide excellent benefits. Autonomous shuttles and buses would put more than 5,200 transit and intercity bus operators at risk of unemployment, which threaten the economic viability of their families and their communities. Our second concern is the public safety of driverless buses. Drivers do much more than operate buses. They help seniors and passengers with disabilities safely aboard and off-board the buses. They report and many times prevent criminal behavior merely by their presence. They assist passengers who may be experiencing medical emergencies such as heart attacks, epileptic seizures, and other health emergencies. They keep an eye on the streets and sidewalks, spotting and rescuing lost children and assisting others in need. Operators are the eyes and ears of our community. Operators are public servants. Without a bus operator, who would take the responsibility for helping passengers? Who would intervene when there is an emergency? We also know that autonomous vehicle technology is far from fail-safe and therefore may threaten the safety of other vehicles and pedestrians. This technology does not operate effectively in bad weather or when roads are poorly marked. It has difficulty navigating around cyclists, scooters, and other vehicles that may act unpredictably. And according to at least one study, the technology has a great difficulty identifying people of color than white people, potentially putting African Americans and other pedestrians of color at higher risk of being hit. In response to our concerns about this automated shuttles, we have began to engage in a fight back campaign in Columbus. Through this campaign, we have been developing a statewide coalition of all allies from faith, disability, environmental, and labor communities, which we call People Before Robots. Our campaign activities have included educating and organizing our members, winning passage of a Columbus City Council resolution recognizing the important role bus operators play in transit systems, and committing to not replacing drivers with technology. We have testified at the Ohio State General Assembly Transportation and Safety Committee hearing on autonomous vehicles. We have gotten coverage in local print and television media and placed op-eds in local papers. We have had candidates running for office to join us in leafletting and educating passengers at transit centers. We have passed a resolution at the Ohio State AFL-CIO annual convention, and most recently held a town hall in Linden community, where Smart Columbus is planning its second driverless shuttle pilot this fall. More about this Linden community. Linden community is a underserved, low-income, predominantly African-American community that suffers an unemployment rate of almost 13%. Smart Columbus has said bringing the autonomous shuttle to Linden will improve access to the transit system and also jobs and services. They also said the community would benefit from better transportation options. In fact, COTA, the Central Ohio Transit Authority, used to provide a circulator route service called the Linden Link. That service was discontinued about 6 years ago. Therefore, instead of pushing for more funding to expand transportation, public transportation, the autonomous shuttle was introduced. At our town hall in Linden, members of the community asked why their community had been chosen to test this experimental driverless shuttle and expressed concern for the safety of their children playing outside. Some residents feel that Linden was selected as a testing ground because decision makers believe they will not stand up and fight back against the proposed project. They are concerned that there will be no one on board to assist passengers with disabilities boarding the vehicle and securing their wheelchairs. People in the community have vowed to organize and fight back against this driverless shuttle. Instead, they want COTA to bring back their Linden Link, better yet, a full-service transit bus in the community. We will continue to build the People Before Robots Coalition and working with Linden and other communities across the state of Ohio to ensure their voices are heard and that they get the transit service they need and deserve. We are planning a second town hall in September, to which we are inviting the mayor, city council members, and COTA leadership to hear from the community. And we will continue to organize to protect good jobs and to protect the public safety throughout Ohio. Thank you for your attention, and I'm available to answer any questions you might have.
Well, we're going to hear from all the presenters, and then we'll have an opportunity for council members to ask questions. Is that all right with everyone here? Okay. We're going to take turns chairing because, that's the way we do things around here. So,
I'm going to open the floor to Shefali Rai to speak to the environmental impacts, and then we can go down the line.
do you want to go?
Yes, thank you, Laura. So I would be weighing in on the proposed environmental impacts of autonomous vehicles. But before we look at the environmental impacts of autonomous vehicles, I would like to briefly highlight some key points of the Pittsburgh Climate Action Plan 3.0 with regards to transportation and land use. As per the Pittsburgh Climate Action Plan 3.0, emission from transportation sector has to reduce by 50% by 2030. And this can be done by way of a 50% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, ensuring no net increase in vehicle ownership, increase in pedestrian commute, bicycle commute, public transit by 50% each, ensuring that 25% of vehicles are electric, and converting the Port Authority buses to 100% electric. Then, of course, you have the other points which discuss reduction in freight emissions. But of all these points highlighted, half of these relate to the transportation infrastructure. With this in mind, I would now like to draw attention to 4 main concerns with respect to introduction of autonomous vehicles in the city. The first, vehicle miles traveled. As per the research conducted by the Union of Concerned Scientists, it has been found that with the introduction of autonomous vehicles, vehicle miles traveled can increase anywhere between 46 to 66%, which would make it challenging to achieve a 50% reduction in vehicle miles traveled as per the Pittsburgh Climate Action Plan. Second, anticipated land use. If all the Port Authority buses and at least 25% of vehicles in Pittsburgh are made electric in line with the Climate Action Plan, then there will be a corresponding need for a charging infrastructure. To add electric vehicles, that is autonomous vehicles, to this mix may result in an increase for land acquisition. To add gasoline-powered autonomous vehicles will not only increase tailpipe emissions, but also increase congestion on streets. Third, effect of air pollution on communities. One of the challenges at the moment is to mitigate the effect of air pollution on the disadvantaged communities, whether economically weak or those that reside in the more polluted parts of the city. It remains uncertain how autonomous vehicles will contribute to this and, more importantly, provide equality. Finally, we believe that the more robust alternative to autonomous vehicles financially and technologically exist in order to reduce air pollution. An example, as suggested by the Climate Action Plan, is to introduce electric buses. Or an even more visible and pressing need would be for bicycle lanes. To conclude, at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we believe that the city needs to look at these aspects, these 4 specific aspects, more closely, and be very cautious in adopting autonomous vehicles in the city in the near future. I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Laura.
We can go to me, yeah.
And before you begin, I want to acknowledge that Hirsch from Councilwoman Erica Strasburger's office is here as well, listening on her behalf.
Thank you. So I'm just going to mention a few things, some of which have already been said, so I won't belabor them. The first, of course, and I'm going to be speaking to mobility and public transit impacts. So for riders with disabilities and older adults, access becomes inhibited if you don't have operators on board, the impact on safety for emergencies and on wayfaring too. So helping people get to their destinations oftentimes requires a driver. I want to say that the most sort of imminent and highly touted use of autonomous vehicles for public transit are in these micro-transit shuttles. So what is being currently deployed in Columbus, what is being suggested as a possibility for the Mon-Oakland corridor. There was a New York Times article, a headline article this weekend where autonomous vehicle company CEOs said that while deployment is not anticipated for much longer than they had originally expected for single use or personal use vehicles, that these micro-transit shuttles are going to continue to be deployed. And we've seen them now in Detroit, in Grand Rapids, and Providence, and Las Vegas, and in Tampa. And so the idea behind these on-demand, so-called first mile, last mile vehicles, micro-transit shuttles, is that there are underserved communities that are not being served by conventional public transit, and this is how you would address that. The problem is that where it's being deployed, so in Columbus, it's being deployed in their downtown, so it's actually directly competing with existing public transit. It is not being deployed in places that are conventionally underserved by transit. In fact, the original intent of the Columbus shuttle was to serve an underserved community, but then they realized that it was too slow in that corridor, so they instead went and started cannibalizing mass transit. And transit deserts in urban and suburban areas occur not because they couldn't be well served by conventional public transit, but that there isn't funding and political will that has made that transit accessible. So it's not about the lack of technology, it's the lack of funding. And as he described with the Linden community, poor neighborhoods have lost service, but instead of investing in them, we decide to experiment on them. And I think that that's a serious problem, given that the safety benefits and more what we're going to hear around data privacy, other implications around vehicle miles traveled and other things are going to disproportionately affect them first. And where these kind of micro-transit shuttles are happening in other cities, they're subsidized by corporations while the testing is happening. So it's not explicit how much the cost per passenger is at this moment, but the closest analog to that is these publicly subsidized on-demand micro-transit shuttles that have a driver in them. And those have been abject failures across the US. The cost per passenger is unsustainably high. I mean, it's in the hundreds of dollars per passenger per ride, with less than 4 boardings an hour. So the question is, why would we invest in that instead of offering conventional public transit that can actually serve riders at a much more reasonable rate at less than $10 per ride? The other implications around public transit really have to do with land use. As the idea, this like personal autonomous vehicle technology becomes more pervasive, it is anticipated that people will live further away from the center of cities rather than more densely within cities, which is what we really need to happen in order to address climate issues and other things. And if you have more sprawl, then there's also increased appetite for personal transportation. So folks, I mean, there are scenarios where these personal autonomous vehicles will deposit people in the center of the city and then they will drive home empty. So there's only one thing worse than single occupancy vehicles, which is zero occupancy vehicles. And then we'll wait till the person is done with their workday and then they'll come back and pick them up. And the costs for having these are higher than existing public transit options, and there's anticipated future forms of social segregation based on people's accessibility to this technology. This is also has implications for lower use of public transit, lower fare revenues, which creates a cycle of service cuts, and then a cycle of disuse with a specific harm for low-income communities and communities of color. So, I mean, I think so when we're thinking about who gets most affected by an adoption of this kind of technology, and if we're trying to serve people that are currently underserved, the predictions for what is going to happen for low-income communities, communities of color, seniors, riders with disabilities, across the spectrum of impacts that we're discussing, we see the most harm for those communities. And lastly, I'm going to say that people live very multifaceted lives, right? So on the one hand, you think, okay, we want to serve the mobility needs of this particular population, but that particular person probably has a cousin or a brother or a father or a sister that works in some job that is likely to see impacts, displacement, wage depression because of, autonomous technology. This same person, may have a grandmother that can't access the vehicle because they use a walker or a wheelchair. I think it's really important to ensure that we're not sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face, right? And thinking about people holistically, thinking about the children that are in communities that already see very bad air quality issues, that they're not the ones that are going to see increased pollution and emissions because of this technology and have a harder time breathing, right? So I'll just leave it at that. I'm open to questions as well. Thank you very much. I'll offer it next to Michael Skirpan, the data privacy ethics representative.
Well, thanks everybody for taking the time to hear about these issues. So I'll just begin to say, I'm a I grew up in the Mon Valley, so I'm a resident of this region for a long time. And as you probably know, the Mon Valley, given especially this corridor planning, is one of the most disconnected regions to Pittsburgh opportunities. And now I do a lot of my work in Wilkinsburg, which is also a community that has very few transportation options. And I think that a lot of options are still on the table. Before I talk about data privacy, I'll just say I think that there are many things that could drive economic development, including improved connections across neighborhoods that are currently disconnected, such as the East End and the South Side, as well as connections to the airport and many other things that would drive economic development. But I always see too frequently that technology becomes the sort of seductive thing that we look for in order to be able to think about how we're going to drive economic development. And so I have a history of, my PhD is in computer science, and I focus on the risks and social impacts of deploying technologies. I've testified in many of these kinds of rooms, as well as published papers on these kinds of things. And really importantly, why I try to do this is that I think technologists are often, whenever they're called upon in these kinds of planning, the technologists who come to the table are the ones that have the incentives to see the technology implemented, and are not technologists who come to speak generally about the technology. So that's one of my goals in my career, is to be a person who speaks to this. So I premise what I'm going to say with that I'm speaking as a technologist who thinks that technology can really benefit people and society, but it is too often seen as an inevitable way in which we need to solve a problem, and then stakeholders who have the incentives to say this is going to solve everything are the ones that come to the table and speak to non-technologists as opposed to technologists who are thinking broadly. So with that said, I want to talk about just the sort of scope of concerns of potentially, if you were to build such a corridor and allow autonomous vehicles to be on it, what are the things that you should actually be looking at? So the first one is to be, what is the scope of the information that will be collected on citizens and on geographical factors of the corridor? So there's a lot of information that potentially could be collected. Probably not a lot of that potential information is needed for functionality on the corridor. And so a first question would be, because there's no regulation and there's no specifications for what kind of data needs to be collected in order to run an autonomous vehicle corridor, there is an immediate question of what kind of data are we going to allow folks to collect? Are we going to collect the maximum amount of data, which is often what people want, because maximum amount of data leads to long-term potential monetization of that data and things that they can do with it. However, that also is primarily exploitative on the people who ride and the people who we're mining the data from. And so I first would say that having an idea or a scope of what data and what specification of that data should be collected, I think would be a really important part of this, so as to not just fall into the trap of companies being like, let's just collect everything, which I think will be a very common way in which the reaction will go from a private sector interest. Similarly, once the data is collected, there's a question of who can license and own that, and who owns that data. Is the person who operates the shuttle the one that owns the data about all of the public citizens now riding on the corridor, or does the city actually retain that data? That's really important, because then, of course, if the private sector owns that data, what they can do in terms of sub-licensing the data and selling it becomes drastically different than if it's owned by the city, who has probably very different means of how they would want to treat that data and what kind of security provisions they'd want to put around it. Similarly, how it's handled and who actually stores that data, like on what servers and things like this, is a big question. As everybody knows, security breaches, data breaches, attack vectors, these are things that are happening pretty much on a daily basis. We're seeing these kinds of things come up in the news, and we know that even really sophisticated companies sometimes struggle with data security. More recently, the Canadian government implemented a massive amount of camera technology around license plate tracking and mobility tracking at the border, and there was a huge data leak on this, which often is actually still, from expert standpoint, blamed because they rushed the technology and did not actually think about how to store the data and protect it correctly. So I would definitely consider making sure that you have a good plan around that. Next, I would say that consent and transparency about how the data is being collected, what data is being collected, and who it goes to is going to be really important. When a rider steps on, very similarly, whenever you guys use your online services or your phone or whatever, you have contracts that regulate who gets that data, how. Do you get to know who has that data? There's a lot of stuff that's specified there. Is that going to be on the bus ticket? How exactly, what is that consent process for being able to be tracked by however? And I'm not saying, again, it could be maximal tracking, could be minimal tracking. However, I think a rider has the right to know what kind of tracking is going on and what data they are basically consenting to give you by getting on the shuttle or walking near the corridor or whatever. And I think that thinking about the transparency around how people are informed about that and thinking about what that consent negotiation is a really important one that I hope that the city would own, as opposed to, again, a private shuttle owner. A next thing that I'm, concerned about is, given the idea of we don't know who would own the data, is the monetization threat, and the fact that monetization is definitely one of the ways a lot of people getting caught in the loop of just always collect more data. Because once you have some, then people say, well, if you collect even more information, we could actually sell that and potentially pay for, long-term maintenance fees of this corridor, of the technology in general. However, monetization is a sort of a threat for the people who paid tax dollars and said, hey, we will build this corridor, and now somebody else might be making money off of their use of that corridor. So I think that's something to make sure you think about, especially in any contract negotiations up front, is what happens with any data that gets monetized. Similarly, there is, now that we're thinking about sharing data, you have the idea that a lot of people might be concerned about, is this a mechanism for surveillance? Is this a way in which people are going to have their data shared by authorities they may be concerned about? And so I'm specifically thinking here about vulnerable populations such as immigrants who might be in our city, who I know our city cares about and wants to protect. However, they might be very concerned that their mobility can be tracked by being on such a corridor. Now, of course, buses already have this potential, of course, to track people, but as of right now, we have ways you can ride that are just with like credited tickets and are anonymous. I have no idea whether that will be the case with a shuttle, which might have cameras on it and other kinds of technologies that can break privacy. But I think it's something to think about, because we might diminish the interest in, say, immigrant populations using a shuttle if they know that that information could be shared with DHS or ICE or anybody who requests it. I highly suggest having a chief data officer or privacy officer that sits over top of a strong engineering team before any kind of implementation of this, to make sure that you yourselves, city council, and our sort of local public is equipped to be thinking forward about this issue and not just at the whim of a technology company who brings their experts to bear on it. Finally, I think that what we want to think about in terms of implementing technology is asking the public about what kinds of patterns, movement patterns, are right now affecting people negatively, what kinds of movement patterns could affect people positively, and we could potentially use autonomous vehicles, new lanes, all kinds of things to improve those patterns that we want to incentivize and that we want people who are lacking access to jobs or lacking access to opportunity or having to take multiple buses to get to different places. I think that thinking about that and the design parameters around how to actually solve the problems that are there are really important, because then we can design the technology and implement such a technology with people's sort of interests in mind, because this project coming at this time does sort of, to me, smell as something that somebody wants in the private sector, that a bunch of folks who have very specific interests want this particular lane. And of course, there are going to be benefits to such a lane. But the question is this the best benefit across all of the different things we could do to improve mobility around the corridor? And if we're going to take the time to put and deploy a really sophisticated technology and put public taxpayer dollars into creating that space and that platform for such a technology, I think we should do it in a way that supports the patterns of life that we want in this city, as opposed to ones that are proposed to us, and not letting the menu be sort of fixed for us and then we just choose the menu option that somebody has proposed, as opposed to us sort of making a planned idea of what we want and then going to the private sector and saying, now would you help us make the plan that our citizens want? So I'm open to any questions further about technology and data, and thank you.
While we are changing speakers, I just want to acknowledge that Councilwoman Harris has also joined us. Thank you, Councilwoman. And I believe we're going to Mr. Borer next.
Yep. How's it going? As I said, I'm the Advocacy Director of Bike Pittsburgh, 3,500 member nonprofit bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organization, working to make Pittsburgh streets safer for walking and biking. So it's no surprise we've tried to take a leadership role in making sure people who walk and bike are considered in this autonomous vehicle development, especially since we represent some of the most vulnerable road users and who the industry readily admits that they still struggle, quote, to anticipate what they're going to do next. We're already seeing some of these solutions that may include things like further criminalizing pedestrian, like jaywalking, for instance, or expecting bicyclists to wear a beacon in order to be seen by a autonomous vehicle. So I'd like to start off by saying that our relationship with AVs is complex. The majority of our members, tired of speeding and aggressive Pittsburgh drivers, welcome the idea of a vehicle that doesn't drive drunk and distracted and is programmed to follow the law and leave them alone. Some say they may even calm traffic by acting as a pace car. At the same time, some of our members have a healthy skepticism about what this future means for them and our city. In the spirit of full disclosure, we have also taken money from AV companies to help support our mission and specifically our Open Streets programming. That said, over the past few years, We have uncovered some serious safety concerns combined with decisions that some companies have made, left us wondering whether safety is their primary concern. In 2016, when AVs first appeared on public roads, almost immediately a video surfaced from San Francisco of an AV running a red light at full speed, followed by an incident where one illegally turned across a bike lane while on a demo with our friends from the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition on board. The car swiftly went from a futuristic novelty to a real public safety concern. Shortly after those incidents, we launched one of, if not the first, public survey on sharing the road with AVs. Nearly 1,300 Pittsburghers responded to the survey, providing us with an invaluable insight into how Pittsburghers are feeling about sharing the road with robot cars. 2 years later, we launched it again, collecting another 800 local responses. The findings were interesting. For instance, most bicyclists reported actually feeling safer sharing the road with AVs than they did with human drivers, which may tell more about Pittsburgh drivers than AVs. Additionally, the results revealed some patterns that left us with concerns, namely that AVs tended to pass bicyclists with less than 4 feet next to a bike lane, and how they sometimes didn't yield to pedestrians in crosswalks. There was one report in which an AV passed a bicyclist so close that the side view mirror struck the rider, and multiple reports where AVs unsafely passed riders on Railroad Street near the notoriously dangerous train tracks embedded in the road. None of those incidents were reported to the police, so most likely the city doesn't know about them until now. One trending comment that we saw over and over was how when these incidents happened, there was no one to report the information to. The cars don't have a "How's my driving" sticker on them with a phone number to call. Lacking a place to report these interactions, both good or bad, we decided to start our own reporting form found on our website. Our work on this issue has got us invited to present at the Pennsylvania Autonomous Vehicle Summit. We've shared our data analysis with academics, AV companies, national and local media, other city officials, and even a DARPA project wanted this data. We were invited to participate then in the city's Shared Use and Autonomous Vehicle Working Group. For a moment, it seemed the city was addressing our concerns and proactively planning for an autonomous future, one that the rest of the world will be closely paying attention to. Then in Tempe, Arizona, an Uber AV struck and killed Elaine Hertzberg. It was sad, yet not surprising that she was a pedestrian walking with a bicycle. Shortly thereafter, a report surfaced of an AV driving on the sidewalk here in Pittsburgh, something we would not have known about had it not been for an industry whistleblower. When the Pittsburgh principles were announced, an agreement between the city and autonomous vehicle companies, it gave us some pause. While some of the policies in the agreement are laudable, it was created without consulting the city's own AV working group in which we sit. For instance, the Pittsburgh principles only require a report if there is a crash resulting in an injury, if the AV is broke a law, or if there was $5,000 in vehicle damage. But did anybody notice that the average bicycle only costs a few $100s, meaning that unless you reach that threshold, you're not being counted. Additionally, we were told, and not really consulted with, that AVs may be allowed on our car-free trail system if this Mon Oakland thing happens. We need to state clearly that we encourage the city to seek grants and proactively work on important policy related to AVs, but it's important that the AV working group and the public be at the table, engaged in this healthy debate. Right now, the only people we have to trust whether the technology is safe or not is the companies themselves. Meanwhile, we need to have honest conversations about the impact that AVs will have on the design of our streets. We have a chance to build a city we want to live in, and not one built just for the cars. But it's not clear how that will happen if the city is only talking to industry on what our autonomous future will look like. With that, I'll end by saying thanks to all of you at City Council for providing this opportunity for us to talk. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you all for presenting to us. The traditional format now is for the chair to open it up to council members, and usually we kind of go down the row. Sometimes the format, if everyone's got similar questions, can be interrogative and just go back and forth, be more free-flowing, excuse me. But yes, thank you. So Councilwoman Smith has suggested that Councilman O'Connor start, and I want to acknowledge that you've hosted your own autonomous manufacturing post agenda. It was about 2 years ago, it seems like.
Yes, thank you. I was going to mention that. Yes, so thank you for that. Yeah, we hosted one specifically about jobs. So those were the questions I was going to ask you from Columbus. So you mentioned that you guys won the Smart City Challenge. Now, there is still a driver in these vehicles that they're demoing or not?
Yes, currently it's still a driver. They are being named as a attendant or an ambassador.
Okay. So basically their role just at this point would be if somebody needs help on and off, or if there's an incident on, and what is it? Is it like a bus, a shuttle?
Currently, their role is acting as a tour guide.
Okay.
They are basically trying to ease the public opinion on the autonomous vehicle technology.
Okay. Are they even sitting
Yes,
in the driver's seat? They're still
yes,
sitting in the
they're
driver's
sitting
seat.
in the
Okay.
driver's seat. Yes, they take over in case of an emergency or in case of bad
Okay.
weather.
So how many bus drivers do you have in Columbus?
In Local 208, we have 680 bus operators.
Oh.
Now, that does not include school bus operators. That's just in the public transit.
And are you guys, so we have a little bit of a difference between us and the county. The county actually operates, the Port Authority here. Does the city operate your transit system?
We're part of the county.
Oh, you're part, so
Yes,
the county
yes.
operates it just like we have here?
Yes.
Okay. So with this Smart City Challenge that they won, are they sort of can you see yourselves being let go soon? Is there like any time frame of that?
Yes, we do see that as a direct threat to us. Again, in this community, the Linden community, we had buses that serviced that area. 6 years ago, we stopped servicing that area. And now, instead of reservicing that area, now they're introducing these autonomous driverless shuttles.
See, when we had our manufacturing summit, as Councilwoman Gross mentioned, it was interesting because we didn't talk about transit drivers to your extent. We actually talked about, it was actually the Teamsters that came in and spoke, because, when you're going on highways, it's a little bit different because you need somebody to offload the car.
Correct.
And that, who knows where technology is going to be in 15, 20 years, and we don't want to get to that point to lose any jobs. So that's the difference that we saw when we spoke to the Teamsters, is that, there's still a need for them to be there. You're still saying that there will be a need.
Yes, there will.
Yes,
there will
no matter
always
what.
be a
Right.
need, especially in the public transit industry.
Yeah.
It's public service.
Right.
I don't think that we should treat public transit as, someone who just wants them a autonomous car. We do have a whole lot of our customers who need help.
Right.
Again, the instances that I brought out wasn't just something I just threw out there. We have the elderly passengers who get some buses, and sometimes they are not the same person 5 minutes after they get on that bus. Dementia will set in, things like that. We have, again, operators have intervened when they saw small kids in places where they shouldn't be.
So sorry, are you?
No,
I don't want
done.
to
Just,
distract.
I'm hoping I'm talking to the choir here.
Yeah, no, you sound good to me. So the transit line that they operate now in Columbus, you're saying that there was no shuttle service there before, and they sort of pushed it just to do this demo? I mean, I'm breaking it down very.
It's very ironic that
Okay.
we did service that area. There was a transit redesign, and 6 years ago, and that bus stopped service in that area. Now, in the second phase of this, they're introducing this driverless shuttle.
Okay, so it was already
in that area.
that transit was already there, taken away, and now
Correct.
back for this purpose.
Correct.
Okay, and then I want to shift to Michael. So when you mentioned data, maybe I just didn't get it. You're talking about, obviously you would measure how many people ride a day. I understand that, but are you also talking about privacy data? So like if I take my Connect card and I log in on one of these AV transits, you're saying that the private owner of that information now could send me something, let's say the transit line goes past a restaurant or whatever that might be. Are you saying take that much personal data, or just the data of riding the vehicle?
So I'm assuming, as hopefully you guys are thinking about how things like accessibility might be a key factor of how people get on the bus. So what I'm thinking about more is I'm assuming the bus is going to have some kind of sensing apparatus. I'm almost 100% certain it's going to have cameras, potentially that are along the corridor as well that help track movement data and things like this, let alone maybe other things like Bluetooth beacons or something inside the actual shuttle to figure out where people are sitting and how people move inside the shuttle. So there's a lot of different capture mechanisms that can go on. I don't know, you're talking about a Connect card. Is a Connect card even what's going to be used on this kind of shuttle? I don't
know. I was just using that as an example, you know, like, okay, are we going to be able to track, okay, Tom and Mary Smith are now on the shuttle from 3 to 6. Oh, sorry. Do you?
I think there's
Smith's a common name. It's a common name. Yeah.
Tom and May O'Connor. That's right.
But you can, you're, at least from what I gathered from you, is now it's more we can track where those individuals possibly could be if it's run privately. If it's city, you know, most of our data we wouldn't share with the public.
Right.
But if it's run by a private company, they can now track that family and see what they're up to. Is it?
Yeah, it could
to that
be,
extent.
The extent to which this stuff is happening and what is like sort of at the cutting edge of capability is actually far beyond that. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that defies our intuition. Like, for instance, just to use an example to sort of help understand and orient ourselves on what kind of intuitions we need to have, what they found with, like, for instance, when people use Twitter, using your Twitter data, we can guess whether you have heart disease with up to a 90% accuracy. This is a thing that is not in our normal intuition about data and what even matters with data, right? So the kind of thing I'm talking about is if they're going to say, look at the movement pattern of someone approaching the vehicle, because they might need to figure out, is this a person that I need to, like, lower the bus for? Do I need to create an extended ramp or whatever? Now, what's in that data that could just be a camera feed or could even be something less than that, it could just be movement data of how quickly something approaches the vehicle, something like this. That data actually carries the statistical inference to say, so now you get on the bus, maybe you just had surgery and you're limping, or you have a cane with you. And you would think, I'm not riding the bus and I'm not trying to expose myself on the idea that, like, I have back problems. However, the way that you move is actually very statistically unique, and then I can use that data to say, oh, actually, Corey has back problems. And so now you don't have to, of course, do that. That's all post hoc analysis of the data. But it is stuff that is very possible, which is why I was saying it's like the scope of what data is collected is really important, because the moment you have a large scope and then the moment you have a sort of engineering team that wants to make useful marketing analysis of that scope of data, they can start trying to infer all kinds of things. Yeah, so I think you are starting on the right trail of thinking, like, okay, well, maybe they want to know what areas you're passing by and they want to sell you something. And so that is like a first order magnitude kind of what could happen. But the sort of second, third order, the stuff that gets less intuitive, is actually making things like medical inferences or outing that somebody has an accessibility need. And we can actually do that fairly easy with that kind of data. And so that's the kind of question I have about, are they going to be allowed to make those inferences? Are they going to collect data that actually can expose people in that way? And then can that be monetized? Because certain people are really vulnerable, especially like the disabled are very monetizable in this way because they have very unique needs and purchasing needs and things like this. So marketers want to know that. But often folks who are disabled don't want to disclose that about themselves, and they should have a right not to. So that's a kind of question I would have.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, actually, Laura, I think you brought this up. And I'm, again, might have heard this wrong, but did you say we want people to live further away from the urban?
I'm saying that's one of the
that's one of the goals, yeah, because
well, not one of the goals, one of the outcomes.
That's one of the outcomes. Well, obviously, I mean, if everybody had an autonomous vehicle, and I always think about this when I'm driving through the tunnels, because everybody knows when you drive through the tunnel in Pittsburgh, you get through, you lose half of our population. Right. But ultimately, if you did live in Monroeville, it would almost be like a train system if everybody had an autonomous vehicle. You know, you'd set the car at 60 miles an hour, everybody would move quicker through there. However, the problem is you're going to have more people on the roads, which then creates your problem to where, okay, well, my drive from, you know, Monroeville is, right now it's 45 minutes to Pittsburgh, but if everybody is on this new system, we all push a button in our car and we're now there in 15. So you were saying exactly what I thought you said. I just might have heard it wrong, is that this would actually drive people further away.
Well, so when I say that further away, I don't mean Monroeville necessarily.
Well,
I mean like
that's-
Erie, right?
yeah,
like, so
right.
No, I'm serious. Like I think if you have
Monroeville's not far.
if you
My
have
in-laws live there. It's not
if
that
you have
far
a
away.
2 hour,
Yeah.
like a 2 hour commute, but the whole time you're hands free. You can watch a video. You
Right.
can do whatever. I think that we're talking much bigger push out, and I think that the ideal is not that people are like. It won't necessarily make people's commute faster too, because more people might have personal vehicles that they'll adopt.
Still drive, right? Yeah. No, that's what I thought you meant. I just wanted to make sure I had.
I also
that.
just want to caution that I think the discussion that we're hoping to have, and maybe this is in the interest of what council wants to talk about, is simply public transit, but I think mass adoption of autonomous vehicles includes personal ownership, and I think a lot of the impacts that we're talking about also are amplified under a system where people have personal autonomous vehicles as
Right.
well.
Yeah. No. That was the point that I was making when you went to personal. If you're living further away, that was the issue that I had. Again, thank you guys for coming. I want to thank Councilwoman Gross as well as Councilwoman Smith for calling for this and hosting this as well. I think this is obviously an important issue. We got a lot of good guidelines from all of you as to what to look out for if this conversation continues down the road. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, appreciate it. Do you want to start up the top of the table, Councilwoman Smith, and work our way down?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Want to go next? No? Councilwoman Harris?
No, I'm good. I'm waiting. I want to hear the conversation. I'm good.
Councilman Coghill?
I came in late.
Councilman Coghill?
Okay, I'll be short. I don't have many questions.
Come by Adam. You don't see us like this on TV all the
We
time.
get along here in Pittsburgh, Jarvis. Yeah. Welcome to Pittsburgh. I love Columbus. Beautiful city. So are you telling me, Jarvis, that you use autonomous vehicles downtown Columbus? People get on them on a regular basis as of today?
They are.
I know they're manned from Councilman O'Connor. I get that, but
Currently, they put them. It's in like a isolated part of downtown. They call it the Scioto Mile. It has a 1 mile track,
so
and it's
it's like a Kennywood. It's like an amusement park ride.
Yeah.
So it's just not actually transporting people to destinations.
No. It just stops at about 3 or 4 tourist shops.
And
stops.
Is that to be the extent of it? Is it just a little ride for everybody?
Well, they had to do something after it failed
Sure.
in the Eastern Township community.
Yeah. Is the money spent? Is it?
Now, see, now we get into the logistics of the finance and everything, and again, we got wind of this in the last quarter. Put it that way. It was late 2017 when we heard about this,
Right.
and after speaking to a whole lot of state representatives, they was shocked, especially when we pointed out to them what the actual language in the proposal said, that was the main thing for the autonomous vehicle was to cut costs by eliminating the operator and removing all onboard equipment that support a human operator. That's in the language.
And that's the most disturbing thing to me about the autonomous vehicles, I'll tell you. Other than I don't have the confidence in just getting on any vehicle without a driver. I just really don't. But, okay, so it's not really being put to use in Columbus yet. It's not displaced jobs yet.
Well, currently, we ask that they put an operator on board.
Right. Getting the same pay scale as they did as a driver.
Correct. But they came up with this ambassador, which is paid a way lower wage than an operator, a trained operator. You know, our operators are very well trained. They have CPR training. They go through some homeland security training. They are members of the community.
Right, sure.
They care about the community.
Sure. So those were added jobs, though. They weren't transportation jobs. They weren't a bus driver that has been demoted to a,
No.
what did you call it, a chaperone? What is it?
They call them ambassadors.
Ambassador, okay, right. Sounds fancy.
Yeah, it does.
Right. So, okay, so you don't actually have had, you've not yet come to the point where the drivers have lost jobs because it's really not transporting people.
Well, we have lost service, sir.
Okay, sure.
Yes, in the Linden area, we used to serve that area. Again, 6 years ago,
And they've discontinued it, and they haven't gone back to Linden. So Linden's stuck. And the reason why the autonomous vehicles, they scrapped it from transporting from Linden to Columbus was because of the road, because of the route.
Yes, from Easton to Columbus.
Yeah. That's what puzzles me, because in Pittsburgh, I would think it would be so much harder to find a route here, being with the hills and the valleys and the, everything else that we have, are skinny roads as we have them. You're at least more spread out and have some room. And they had a hard time finding passageway from Linden toward.
Well, it was Easton. It was a public safety issue because it wasn't traveling fast enough to cross the intersection.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just wanted to get your thoughts. Thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy your stay. Shafali, I know that you had said about the this may sound like a stupid question, but what would an autonomous vehicle? What do your autonomous vehicles run on? What are they? Gas? Are they electric? What are they?
Electric.
Electric. They're all to be electric.
At the moment, not all of these are electric.
Got it.
Yes.
Right. So as far as air quality goes, electric versus gas.
Well, there's always been that debate, and it's one of the questions we anticipated. But it has been proven time and again that electric vehicles, irrespective of whether they're autonomous or not, are cleaner than gasoline-powered vehicles. Mm-hmm. So in the distant future, and because there is a global consensus that as cities expand and the urban population increases, we would see an influx of autonomous vehicles. So it would serve the transportation sector, which is looking to curb emissions, to adopt electric autonomous vehicles rather than gasoline-powered autonomous vehicles.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that, because we're looking to adopt that ourselves in our new transit corridor that we may or may not have. So I just want to get your thoughts on that. Thanks. Michael, I had the same questions as Councilman O'Connor had about privacy, and I understand, I know there are companies out there who would love to know who there's an influx of 18-year-old and unders that ride this vehicle at this time frame. Therefore, they could somehow, market to those people, whether it be ice balls or yo-yos or whatever you're selling, right? So that is really the concern as far as I myself don't have a big footprint, digital footprint out there, so I don't really worry about, people stealing my identity or, marketing to me things I don't want to be marketed. But in today's world, I just assume everybody's information is out there everywhere, whether it be the city holding on to it or a private company holding on to it. But your concern is more, once they get that information, they can turn around and sell it. They could sell it to Amazon, they could sell it to whomever's in the market to get that information. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's also, I would probably venture to say that your digital footprint might not be as clean as you think. If you go to like a data aggregator and find out what kind of profiles they have on you. For instance, if you ever had Facebook and then you delete
help you shut that off.
and then you delete your Facebook doesn't stop collecting information on you. They say, well, who are you friends with? Oh, you were friends with Darlene, you're friends with Corey. Well, they still have Facebook. We're going to actually just proxy your interests based on their interests. So there's a lot of things going on that are way outside of the valence of what you normally just think about. However, those pieces of information are limited, and so certain kinds of information, say something that an insurance provider might want to get or a bank might want to get, which those are things that could have severe impacts on you. They're going to want really certain data. So they're not going to be able to just say, oh, we're going to take some Facebook statistical inference about you. However, things that could be collected very directly on the person, on the physical body, at the point of contact with a driverless vehicle, those are kinds of information that could be very certain. So to me, it's actually not about, I have a very clean data profile, I have no data about me, and now I ride this bus and it adds some data about me. But we're living in this world where people are Target's collecting data on where I walk around their store and things like this, right? So with that said, my point is that this is a particular kind of data tracking that, number one, is happening in a public space. So it's not something that I'm sort of opting into privately for a service. It's a sort of public service. Number two, it's something that's collected directly off of my body, meaning that it's very certain data. So from the perspective of a data scientist, this is really clean data. So if I have an insurance provider that's willing to pay for information about, say, disabled populations in Pittsburgh, this is much better data than, say, just random social media data where things could be falsified. You cannot really falsify your walk or your gait walking up. I mean, I guess you could.
The kind of shoes you wear or the kind of hat you're wearing. I mean, there's a market out there for whatever you're wearing. If you're wearing Nike shoes and they have, actual video footage of you, then yeah.
And it's like we think a lot about the marketing in terms of like, say, oh, I was searching for shoes and now I'm on Amazon, I'm getting ads for shoes. And this is sort of a certain layer of depth that is definitely happening. And I think one that we should all be aware of. But then there's also things like bank determinations. So I go to apply for a small business loan or I go to apply for a mortgage. A lot of banks are now starting to use algorithms to determine creditworthiness. Creditworthiness scores actually take in a lot of different kinds of data about a person. And that data, again, has to be pretty certain. We have rights under the CFRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act. So there are a lot of things that we can't just like sell to banks. However, this is kind of certain mobility information and figuring out if you have a job, or if you have the job you're claiming to have at application, and whether they have sort of information that maybe corroborates or doesn't, that is actually very useful information. So that's kind of where my head is at around this, is that the kind of information that could be, I'm not saying would be, could be collected along this corridor is extremely exposing, and compared to digital footprints that I leave, which are sort of uncertain, they're a little bit vague and a little bit messy. This is very concrete information about a person, and some of that information can cycle back into places like insurance and banks, where the determinations now used from that information actually could have significant impact, as opposed to like just seeing a shoe that I hate or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Sure. Well, listen, I want to thank you all for being here. If you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have said we're light years from replacing vehicles with drivers with autonomous vehicles. I really would have. However, and I still believe in my heart that you can never replace the human element. As I forget it. What's your name, ma'am? Elisa. Thank you, Elisa. Yes, as you so eloquently put, you can't replace the human element. I don't think I'll ever see that day. I hope not, to tell you the truth. I don't think it can be done, but okay, thanks. I appreciate your insight on all this. Yeah.
I'll just return to Councilwoman Smith or Councilwoman Harris. Do you have anything for the speakers?
I wasn't here for the first part, so forgive me if I'm asking questions. But I was here for the second part. I'm not for privatization, any manner of privatization. We had streetcars before. I don't know if any of you have ever rode on a streetcar. It's on the tracks, and they just push some buttons, and it takes you. It used to take you to Westview Park and all over the place. And we had tracks all over downtown Pittsburgh. We had buses too. I personally have a problem with the cars. First, I have a problem with when the mayor left to bring these cars into Pittsburgh. We weren't getting anything for it. At least as far as council knows, we didn't get anything. We didn't even get any of the information, and they were sucking up all this information about our city. And I resent that, because that is our information. I've almost got hit by an Uber over South Side, and there was actually somebody in the vehicle. So I'd really be afraid if they'd start driving them around and not having anyone in them. And it concerns me also when you go and you apply to be a taxi cab driver or bus driver or even a streetcar driver. There is information and you have clearances. There are children and elderly that ride on buses and in taxi cabs or that. And that bothers me. It bothers me that they're taking jobs away. You know, nobody wants to say they're taking jobs away, but that's what they're doing. You know, so what happens when we have all these people that don't have jobs? We add to the welfare. And we, the public, pay for that. It's bad enough when it's hard for somebody to get a job, let alone taking more jobs away. And just like the Ubers, who has the data? Uber. You think Uber is going to give that information over to the city? Really? Question.
Not unless it's in the contract.
And there probably is no contract whatsoever. It just looked like a cool thing to bring into the city to start riding people around in and not thinking where this is going, not thinking about what this is taking away from us, what it's taken away from our city, and what possible issues are out there. We heard of a number of them on television already. Accusations, that's all I can call them because I was not in the courtrooms. But driving children around, and that's up to the age 18, sometimes 21. Special needs, not just driving them around, but these people, are using our crosswalks. And sometimes they don't use a crosswalk. But if we're a vehicle, we can see them because we're human. Yes, there's accidents, and I'm sure when they first started out back in, the 20s, or whenever the cars first started out, they told us some of the same things. But I really have a concern because, whether it's a special needs person, whether it's an animal, a bird, it's a death. And what happens? Can you bring those people back once something happens? Special needs is a whole ball. It's not just people that you see that are on crutches or in a wheelchair. There are all kind of special needs out there, and we got to think of that. And we don't even have any of the information. Again, just privatization, and Teresa's trying to shut me off here. And the biggest question is, does the taxpayers benefit from any of this? And I think not. And I know the bike riders might not like this, but it's just like we have bad drivers, we also have bad bike drivers. And, a car is able to move out of the way of a pedestrian or bike. But without somebody there, and maybe I'm thinking old-fashioned, but I haven't seen any information that this city has gotten by letting these Ubers on the street. I mean, we have our own thing in neighborhoods. They're called, where they take you home from getting your groceries.
Access.
No, not access. We have access too.
Jitneys?
Jitneys. Yeah, we have jitneys. And I think I'd rather pay for a jitney because it's a person in there than I would for something that isn't. You never know what's going to happen when you don't have that control. And you have these people riding, and there's no control, and here comes a train. So I don't know about questions because I wasn't here for you, and I apologize. And I really wanted to be at the beginning of this, so I'll talk to you afterwards. But I guess my question is, who really is benefiting from this? And who's not benefiting from this? The people that are either special needs or the people that really need a job. So maybe I have something to say. No? Is that what you've been talking about? Because I didn't hear everything.
I think that the whole report that we put together is asking the question as who would benefit and who's at risk.
Oh, wow.
So if you have some time.
I could have wrote the book then, huh? But I want to thank you all for being here. And I would like to hear from the audience afterwards, and maybe we should have a public hearing too to see what the public thinks about this publicly.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Is that all?
Yes.
Councilwoman Smith?
That's it, or I was going to unplug it. Life support. So, I'm sorry. But now you know who the jokester is on council because you're watching it all. But I just want to say, like I mentioned before, because she's going to shut my mouth.
Oh, it did shut up.
Yeah, but I'll do this. I'll just say that, this is one-sided, and I'd like to hear, we do know that there have been some benefit of having these companies come to Pittsburgh. There are jobs created for a lot of people, and, I don't want to say everything is so negative. I want to say, how can we all come together? And I'm just curious, has there ever been, is there a working group that any of you are part of that has a discussion, they're having these types of discussions with the administration?
We mentioned, like I mentioned in my statement, there is a working group, but it hasn't met since the first month it was created.
Which was when? Could you tell us when that was?
Oh boy.
There was, I think, 2 meetings last year total, and that's the extent of it, May and I think July of last year.
Thank you.
So maybe what we can do is we can talk to the administration about having those meetings and making sure that maybe a council member is also on that task force or group, whatever it's called.
It's called
to
the
make sure
Shared
that
and
we're
Autonomous Working Group.
Okay, to make sure that we're continuing the meetings and having those meetings continue. And I'll be happy to follow up because it's under my committee. I'll be happy to follow up with the administration regarding that, because I do think that there's a lot that they want to do and a lot that they do with Bike Pittsburgh, certainly. And, CMU, we know the relationships with CMU. So I don't think that they're opposed to having these conversations, and I think that they probably want to get to some middle ground where people are comfortable and happy. But for me, I think it's just a philosophical conversation that we have to have. I mentioned before that my niece is a professor, actually a director at Berkeley, the University of Berkeley, and my brother was a dean at Carnegie Mellon. And so, there's a lot of things that I can say about the technology and what it's done for the city of Pittsburgh and how great things have been in some areas. But I can also say that there's been a lot of things that have been negative. My niece at Berkeley can tell you that there's just hundreds of companies that pulled out of that area, and the economy became so reliant upon it that it really has having a negative effect now on that area and on people, because they couldn't over rely on one industry. And so I think that it's a philosophical conversation that we have to have. I keep saying that I want to make sure that our current residents are trained in the workforce area, and I think we are doing some of that now. But there's some very basic things that I think that we could be offering in the city of Pittsburgh. And to me, I think even the coding classes that I've talked endlessly about and how that could help prepare people. The thing that concerns me is the jobs. I can tell you, I got through high school because some people will credit their teacher. I credit my bus driver because he picked me up in front of my mother's house when I was late for the bus every day. And I can tell you that's not going to happen with an autonomous vehicle. So I'd get on the bus and my sister waited for 15 minutes and she'd be with her arms folded. She'd be so angry that she waited and I just was waltzing on the bus. But thankfully for my bus driver, I got through school. And I say I was the original autonomous vehicle because nobody can see me over the dashboard because I'm so short. But I'll just say that I think that, for me, I want to make sure that we're preserving jobs I don't want to see people out of work, especially when you're talking a lot of times about an aging population here in Pittsburgh. A lot of our bus drivers would probably like to retire from those jobs. You know what I mean? I would hate to see them out at older ages looking for new jobs. And so it's just a whole philosophical conversation that we have to have about this whole area. And I think it's comes to when we're talking about the complete streets and all the things that we're talking about, and there's a complete street committee. Are any of you on that?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think it's you're on that too? Okay. I think it's having all those conversations, and during those meetings, does any of this come up?
I haven't heard anything on autonomous vehicles come up. They're focusing on pedestrianism right now.
Right.
They actually just met yesterday.
But that is kind of like, how are the pedestrians going to be safe, right?
Yeah.
So, and for me, I also have asked, and I'll make sure that this happens, is that Pioneer students, I go out there sometimes to see the students out there. And it's not in my district, it's in Councilman Cogghill's district, but Bernadette Hughes, who came here and spoke last week or so about some other issue that they were having. When I went out there, the students asked if they could be a part of some of these conversations because they have challenges that other people do not have or do not know about and may not be aware of, and they just want to make sure that they're included in these conversations, and so that there's a diverse group of opinions, even in the world of the disability community. So I want to make sure that those folks are heard and at the table as well. But I will talk to the administration, and I will also follow up with, and if that's not going to happen, that group is not going to meet, maybe we can perform something here on City Council, and we can start working with all of you collectively with some of the administration. We can form our own type of group and take those things back to council members in the mayor's office, working together. But I do think that, I think that the mayor's office, the administration is doing a lot in this area. And I think that they're doing a lot in the streets and about trying to make the streets safe, which really is a daunting task when you think about it. I mean, when you look at our sidewalks and utility poles and things that are just, that you're just thinking about just walking safely and traveling safely on sidewalks. When you talk about streets, it's just a whole different complexity. Yeah. And with bike lanes, I've always said, if it were me, I would have taken 5 years and said we're going to focus on the current infrastructure needs, fix it up, and work on simultaneously on a really great bike infrastructure. That's what I would like to see. But I think sometimes you don't always have that option. When your constituents want you to do things like today or yesterday, you don't always have that option. So that's it for me before Councilwoman Harris shuts off my mic. But I want to thank you for being here. And thank you. I think we're going to have some more conversations.
If you don't mind, I actually have my turn as well. So before you
say
goodbye. Okay, you're good. Yeah. I want to make sure you were being so authoritative. I was afraid I was going to get cut off.
Councilwoman Gross, you always end the show so nicely. I just have a quick question.
That's the grandmother.
Absolutely, Councilman, go ahead. Okay, Jarvis, this is something that struck me before I forgot to ask you about. You said these autonomous vehicles recognize a lighter skinned person more than a darker skinned person. So what is that technology about? So it goes by your pigment? I mean, I
don't know. It's just the pigment of your skin. We do have researchers from our international union in Washington. They pulled up, that's where we get information from.
Yeah, that's a question, I guess, for the industry. Is that right?
I could actually probably shed some light on this. So there's a large conversation about sort of data bias and fairness that's happening across the data science and AI community. And part of the issue is you can look this up, there's a really great woman at MIT, Joy Bolawimi, and she has a group called the Algorithmic Justice League. And what they're looking at is why a lot of different technologies that are built, especially ones that use biometric features, tend to disproportionately be incorrect or inaccurate for people of color. And one of the primary reasons is because the technologists who are training the information, technology is an industry that is absolutely dominated by the white community, and access points for people of color to get into the technology industry, that's a whole conversation that's happening and is well known and concerning. And part of what's happening there is so Joy, her work is looking at face recognition technology in particular, and why face recognition technology. So she has this very famous video of her approaching Microsoft's very famous face recognition software, and it does key point analysis. It looks at where your eyes are, where your nose are, these things, and it fails on her face as a black woman. And then when she puts on a white mask, it immediately works and recognizes her face. And this has to do with you need millions and millions of data samples trained against a piece of software to be able to correctly identify these things. And so whenever you're working on a team of engineers who they're using their faces to train these things and test them, and none of them are people of color, it maybe isn't that surprising that then they go deploy it and none of them are people of color. And even Google has released software with these kinds of problems. And this is the biggest data operation in the world is Google. And they released a software that was supposed to do object identification and identify people and objects and images, and it misidentified African Americans systematically immediately upon release, and they literally didn't know what they had to do, and they just had to redact the
Okay,
features.
well, that
So
makes
this
sense,
is
Michael.
there.
We obviously aren't accusing the autonomous industry of, intentionally not identifying people of color. In your words, though, Michael, I take it as because of the lack of people in that industry, whether, the lack of diversity in that industry is why it's kind of...
It's at least one dimension of it, yes.
Got it. The other thing was mechanics, as far as, we know, obviously, we don't want to displace our drivers, autonomous vehicles. However, do they have little robots that do all the mechanical work too, or we're going to put mechanics out of work too, or?
From our research, we're finding out that they are planning on these autonomous shuttles are planning on having a shelf life. So after so many hours,
Got it.
they just
Okay, that's good. That's fine. I'll turn it back to the chair then.
Councilwoman Smith and
I
Harris
just
both
want to
want to chime in.
say, I just want to say facial recognition doesn't always work. Every time I, posted some photos of my family, I'd see my sister-in-law's name come up. Well, here I finally looked one day. It was my husband. They think it's my sister-in-law. So everything keeps tagging up on the phone. So it doesn't work for everybody.
Councilwoman Harris.
He's going to kill me for sharing that story.
Okay. CMU was working on a Cadillac, my understanding was.
I'm just to be clear, not a part of like the autonomous driving folks at CMU. I'm a computer ethicist. I go around and teach faculty how to put ethics in their technical
And I figure if it hasn't come out from CMU, it's probably not right yet.
I'm happy to ask. Do you want me to
Would you
chime in?
please?
Yeah. So I'll also take my turn if council people are finished. And just to disclose, I always do, my husband also works at CMU and is the executive director of the Traffic 21 Institute, which does a lot of intelligent transportation work. So I always want to share that. And I think that he does work with the researchers who worked on that vehicle, but I'm not able to speak to it. So what I really appreciate about this post agenda is that we have a lot of conversation to do publicly, right? I feel like each one of these topics, and I just want to reiterate for the public, jobs, public transit, and mobility, and I want to say that was kind of equity as well, environmental impacts, safety and privacy, almost feel like we've just scratched the surface. And a very nicely summary for us here, but you can tell that there's really deep conversations to be had around each of these topics. So it's almost like we need to kind of keep the conversation going and drill down a lot deeper. And your document, I know that you were sharing it at the press conference. Wait, who's driving this thing? Is available online?
It is available online.
And then you want to share with us where it's available?
Sure. I mean, you can find it on our website, www.pittsburgh4publictransit.org.
Okay, great. And so this post agenda was a summary of a lot of the points, but there still is a lot more there. And I want to say that while we spent a lot of time on the risks, which are so well documented and also cited in the I think 100+ scholarly papers, I think that you said, are cited in summary here in the literature review, that I think the right place for us to continue the conversation also is to talk about those opportunities for the way things could be and should be, right? That would be more fair, right? And so while we're taking things into account, as council members so eloquently asked their questions about, who benefits, who pays, I think is a lot of what, Laura, your comments were about as well, right? What is the right place for us to spend, right? This is our table and these are our funds as a citizenry, right? We are, as the citizens of the city of Pittsburgh, where do we choose to spend our public dollars? And to really be aware of where we're committing funds and who benefits from the funds that we commit. So when we're talking about infrastructure, land use, and talking about choosing mobility corridors and who is benefiting in what neighborhoods from those investments, I think is something really to keep in front of us at this table and to really get public input on. And when we're talking about, where land is available and who is owning that land and what might be there in some place, especially as we've heard so much testimony around the Almano site, and I'm sorry, Councilman O'Connor left because I don't want to speak for him at all, but that this is, I think, an important place to have this conversation, that this is the appropriate place to have this conversation. But also to speak to Councilwoman Smith's points about where we do, and so many of the testimony today about where we choose to do infrastructure improvements, whether it's on sidewalks, whether it is complete streets, whether it is on bike lanes. Keep in mind, I always like to remind council that we are actually rebuilding our infrastructure now, that it is over 100 years old and it is collapsing, and all those sewer collapses and all those gas lines that are 100 years old and all of the telecommunications that will need to be deployed. We didn't even touch on 5G to do this near-field communications. Those are all in this exact same right-of-way, right, where we're trying to prioritize people and people's safety and people mobility, and not just cars and car safety and car mobility, right? That is the wrong place for us to be thinking, and we should be prioritizing and centering people and their needs and our citizens and their needs, as Representative Innamorato, I think, so eloquently pointed out. And not just the direct expenditure of public dollars, but also incentives. Council, I think, has been very active in having conversations about, well, the things we put in front of our, forward in 2007 around incentives for real estate development, for example, need to be revisited. And we've been struggling with that topic now for about a year, and we have it on our agenda again tomorrow to amend some of our tax abatement the legislation. So we're still kind of talking about what are the things that we're spending money on and what are the things that we're incentivizing. And this is an opportunity to talk about how I think our mobility needs and our land use decisions kind of intersect, as well as the millions of dollars that we're currently spending on infrastructure and what opportunities those provide. And we've talk about utility coordination, and that's really the shorthand for that conversation. Like when we know we're going to give a permit to People's Gas or a permit to PWSA or a permit to a telecom industry to tear up a street, we know it can have negative ramifications, like my constituents are suffering in Morningside right now because Port Authority buses can't even get through and people are struggling to get through the streets because the permits were all issued at the same time without thinking about detours and how people were going to get in and out of the neighborhood. But it also provides an opportunity for those capital expenditures and making those choices, because we're really, this is not maintenance, this is rebuilding the city underneath the streets as well, and that we're putting these things in place for a very long time. Lastly, I want to say to Mr. Skirpin, I think that you cited that the federal legislation is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it seemed like you were talking, is that what it's called?
Yep. The Consumer Fair Credit Reporting Act, it's an FTC regulation, and it just ensures that you can amend your credit report and that you get correct information on your credit report and credit information. And this is one of the best regulations we have that protects consumers from selling data right now about financial and credit worthiness and things.
And then you opened our eyes about how mobility or all of this technology data is not reported and is not regulated. And we really need this. And so it sounded like you were describing a kind of Fair Mobility Data Act that's not in place.
That's right.
We don't have federal protection. And so what is our capacity? I think the open-ended question is, what is our capacity at the city level to try to provide some level of protection and equity around these issues as well. So this is really a deep and great introduction, unfortunately, I feel like it's just an introduction to a lot of still really big questions, but very important ones. So thank you all for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. It's been, I think, incredibly beneficial to council members, and I hope to the public as well. Are we ready to adjourn? All right, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Thank you.